The apartment building was engulfed in flames when 58-year-old Marcus Thompson heard the screams from the fourth floor. Everyone else was running away from the fire, but this homeless veteran was running toward it. In the next 12 minutes, he would save 5 lives and reveal a military past that would leave an entire community speechless. Marcus Thompson has been sleeping behind the dumpster at Riverside Apartments for exactly 8 months and 16 days, not because he's keeping count, but because routine is survival, and survival is all he's known for the past 3 years since he lost his apartment, his job, and what felt like his place in the world. The residents of Riverside Apartments see him as part of the urban landscape, something unfortunate but inevitable, like broken streetlights or graffiti on the walls. They've learned to walk past without making eye contact, to pretend they don't notice when he's there, and to feel slightly relieved when he's not. To them, Marcus is just another casualty of a system that doesn't work, another reminder of problems too big and complicated for any individual to solve. What they don't know is that Marcus Thompson spent 22 years in the United States Army, including 4 tours in Afghanistan, where he specialized in urban combat and emergency rescue operations. They don't know that he holds a Bronze Star for pulling 6 wounded soldiers from a burning Humvee in Kandahar, or that he was trained in advanced fire rescue techniques that saved countless lives in situations where every second meant the difference between survival and tragedy. What they also don't know is that Marcus chose to sleep behind Riverside Apartments for reasons that had nothing to do with convenience or safety, and everything to do with the fact that he'd been watching the building for months, recognizing fire safety violations that kept him awake at night with worry for the families living inside. On this particular Tuesday evening in October, those concerns were about to prove tragically prophetic. Marcus had been settling in for the night behind the dumpster when he heard the first sign of trouble, not the screams or the smoke alarm, but the subtle sound of electrical arcing that he'd learned to recognize during his years of urban warfare. It was the sound of wiring failing catastrophically, the kind of electrical fire that spreads faster than people can react, and turns livable spaces into death traps within minutes. He stood up immediately, grabbed the small backpack that contained everything he owned, and walked around to the front of the building to assess the situation. The fire had started on the 2nd floor, in apartment 2B, and was already spreading upward through the building's ventilation system and shared walls. Marcus could see the orange glow behind the windows and hear the first tentative shouts of residents who were just beginning to realize that the smoke they were smelling wasn't coming from someone's cooking. Marcus had seen this scenario before, in different contexts and different countries, but he knew exactly how it would unfold. The fire would spread faster than anyone expected, the smoke would disorient people trying to escape, and the building's outdated fire safety systems would prove inadequate to handle a real emergency. But what concerned Marcus most was his knowledge of the building's layout and the family that lived in apartment 4C. Over the past 8 months, Marcus had observed the daily routines of every resident in Riverside Apartments, not from any sense of voyeurism or invasion of privacy, but from the heightened situational awareness that never leaves a soldier, even when that soldier is living on the streets and fighting a different kind of war for survival. He knew that the Martinez family, Carlos, Maria, their 3 children aged 6, 8 and 12, lived in apartment 4C, which was directly above the source of the fire. He knew that Carlos worked late shifts at the hospital and wouldn't be home. He knew that Maria was alone with the 3 children, and that their apartment's only exit led to a stairwell that would soon be filled with smoke and flames. He also knew something that nobody else in the building knew: there was a second way out of apartment 4C. During his months of observation, Marcus had noticed that the building's original fire escape had been partially removed during renovations, but that the structural framework was still intact behind a false wall in the Martinez family's apartment. The framework was accessible through a bathroom window that had been painted shut, but it could provide an escape route if someone knew how to access it and had the skills to make it safe. Marcus had the skills. The question was whether he could reach the family in time. The first fire trucks wouldn't arrive for at least 8 minutes, based on Marcus's knowledge of the city's emergency response times and the traffic patterns in this neighborhood at this time of evening. 8 minutes was too long. By the time professional firefighters could set up their equipment and reach the 4th floor, the Martinez family would be dead from smoke inhalation. Marcus didn't hesitate. He'd made similar calculations hundreds of times in combat situations, and the math was always simple. Act now or live with the consequences forever. He ran toward the building's main entrance, which was already beginning to fill with smoke as residents from the lower floors evacuated. Marcus pushed through the crowd of people fleeing the building, moving with the purposeful determination of someone who understood that panic was more dangerous than fire, if you knew how to control both. The building's elevator was obviously not an option, and the main stairwell was rapidly filling with smoke as the fire spread upward. But Marcus had noticed during his months of observation that there was a service stairwell on the building's east side that connected to the maintenance areas and would likely be clear of smoke for several more minutes. Marcus accessed the service stairwell through a door that was supposed to be locked but that he'd observed maintenance workers leaving propped open during their shifts. The stairwell was narrow and dark, lit only by emergency lighting that cast eerie shadows on the concrete walls, but it was clear of smoke and provided access to every floor of the building. Marcus climbed to the 4th floor in less than 90 seconds, his military training automatically calculating timing, oxygen levels, and escape routes as he moved. When he reached the 4th floor service door, he could hear the Martinez family through the walls, Maria's voice calling for help, the children crying, and the sound of someone trying unsuccessfully to open their apartment door, which was likely warped from heat and jammed in its frame. Marcus kicked in the service door and emerged into the 4th floor hallway, which was rapidly filling with smoke. The heat was intense, and he could see flames beginning to emerge from the stairwell at the far end of the corridor. In a few more minutes, this entire floor would be uninhabitable. Marcus pounded on the door of apartment 4C. Maria. This is Marcus from outside. I'm here to get you out. Marcus. Maria's voice came through the door, confused and panicked. The door won't open. The handle is too hot, and it won't turn. Marcus examined the door and realized that the heat from the fire below had warped the frame enough to jam the door shut. Breaking it down would be possible, but it would take time they didn't have, and it would fill the apartment with smoke from the hallway. Maria, listen to me carefully. Marcus called through the door. I need you to take the children into the bathroom and close the door. Put wet towels under the door crack and wait for me there. I'm coming in through the bathroom window. The bathroom window, but we're on the 4th floor. Trust me, I know what I'm doing. Marcus ran back to the service stairwell and climbed one more floor to the roof access. The building's roof was flat and provided access to the fire escape framework that he'd been studying for months. Marcus had rappelled down the sides of buildings in Afghanistan using improvised equipment, and the skills required for this rescue were identical to missions he'd completed dozens of times in combat zones. Using a length of rope from his backpack, rope that he carried because homeless survival often requires the ability to secure belongings or create shelter, Marcus anchored himself to the building's rooftop ventilation system and lowered himself down the outside of the building to the 4th floor. The bathroom window of apartment 4C was painted shut and secured with old-fashioned window locks, but Marcus had the tools and the knowledge to open it safely. Within 2 minutes he had the window open and was climbing through into the Martinez family's bathroom, where Maria and her 3 children were huddled together, terrified but following his instructions. Are you hurt? Marcus asked immediately, conducting the kind of rapid triage assessment he'd learned in military emergency response training. No, we're okay, but the smoke is getting worse, Maria said, looking at Marcus with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. She recognized him as the homeless man from outside the building, but she couldn't understand how he had appeared in her bathroom or why he seemed so calm and competent in the middle of a life-threatening emergency. We're going to climb down the outside of the building, Marcus explained, helping the children put on the makeshift harnesses he was creating from rope and cloth. I know it sounds scary, but I've done this before, and I'm going to make sure each of you gets down safely. Marcus's military training had included extensive work with civilian evacuations, and he knew how to manage the psychological aspects of emergency rescues as well as the technical requirements. He spoke to each child individually, explaining exactly what would happen and giving them simple, specific instructions that would help them focus on the task rather than their fear. The evacuation took 11 minutes. Marcus lowered each family member individually, using techniques he'd learned for extracting wounded soldiers from buildings under fire. Maria went first, so she could help receive the children on the ground. Then the two younger children, followed by the 12-year-old, who was old enough to assist with his own descent, but still needed guidance and support. Marcus came down last, just as the flames reached the 4th floor and the apartment they'd been trapped in became completely engulfed. The professional firefighters arrived as Marcus was untying the last of his improvised rescue equipment. They found the Martinez family safe on the sidewalk, shaken but uninjured, and Marcus sitting quietly on a nearby bench, his clothes singed and his hands cut from the ropework, but otherwise appearing remarkably calm for someone who had just performed an extraordinary rescue. Fire Chief Rebecca Walsh approached Marcus immediately. "Sir, are you the one who got this family out of the building?" Marcus nodded. They were trapped on the 4th floor. The main exit was blocked by fire. "How did you access the building?" "Our teams haven't been able to reach the 4th floor yet. Service stairwell on the east side, then rappelled down from the roof using the old fire escape framework." Chief Walsh stared at Marcus for several seconds, processing what he'd just told her. "Sir, that's an extremely complex rescue operation. Do you have emergency response training?" "Some," Marcus said quietly. What Marcus didn't mention was that he had more emergency response training than most of the firefighters currently working the scene. What he didn't explain was that the rescue he'd just performed was technically more difficult than many of the operations that had earned him military commendations. What he didn't want to discuss was the fact that his knowledge of urban combat and emergency evacuation procedures had just saved 5 lives using skills that he'd learned while serving his country in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. Maria Martinez approached Marcus as the paramedics were finishing their evaluation of her family. "Marcus," she said, taking his hands despite the cuts and burns that marked his rescue efforts, "I don't know how to thank you. You saved my children's lives." Marcus looked at Maria and her 3 children, 8-year-old Sofia, 6-year-old Miguel, and 12-year-old Carlos Jr., and for the first time in months, he felt something other than the numbness that had defined his life since he'd lost his apartment and fallen into homelessness. "I'm just glad everyone's okay," he said. "But how did you know what to do? How did you know about the window and the fire escape? And how did you get the courage to climb down from the roof?" Marcus hesitated. He'd spent 3 years avoiding questions about his background, deflecting curiosity about his past, and maintaining the anonymity that homelessness provides. But looking at these children who were alive because of skills he'd learned in service to his country, he realized that some stories needed to be told. "I used to be a soldier," Marcus said simply. Over the next hour, as the fire department completed their work and the Red Cross arrived to help displaced residents find temporary housing, the full story of Marcus Thompson began to emerge. Chief Walsh, who had been intrigued by Marcus's professional-level rescue techniques, asked him directly about his military background. Marcus reluctantly explained that he'd served in the army for 22 years, including multiple deployments to Afghanistan, where he'd specialized in urban combat and emergency rescue operations. "What's your current housing situation?" Chief Walsh asked, suddenly understanding why a man with advanced emergency response training had been available to perform a rescue that had saved 5 lives. "I'm between apartments," Marcus said, using the euphemism that homeless veterans often employ to describe their situation. Chief Walsh looked at Marcus, this man who had just performed a rescue operation that would have challenged experienced firefighters, who had risked his life to save a family, and who was apparently living on the streets, despite having decades of valuable skills and training. "Marcus, I'd like to talk to you about something. We're currently hiring for our emergency response training division. We need someone with your background to help train our teams in urban rescue techniques." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. He'd been turned down for jobs countless times over the past 3 years, usually because of his appearance, his lack of a permanent address, or employers' assumptions about homelessness and reliability. "Are you serious?" he asked. "Dead serious. What you did tonight proved that you have exactly the skills we need, but more than that, you have the judgment and the courage to use those skills when it matters most." 3 weeks later, Marcus Thompson started his new job as a senior instructor with the City Fire Department's Emergency Response Training Division. The job came with a salary that allowed him to rent a small apartment 6 blocks from Riverside Apartments, where he'd spent 8 months living behind a dumpster. But Marcus's story didn't end with his new job. The Martinez family refused to let Marcus disappear back into anonymity. Maria and her children became advocates for homeless veterans, working with local organizations to connect veterans living on the streets with the services and support they needed to transition back into stable housing and employment. Carlos Martinez, Sr., who worked as a nurse at the regional hospital, used his connections in the medical community to organize a support network for homeless veterans dealing with physical and mental health challenges that often contribute to their housing instability. The three Martinez children, Sofia, Miguel and Carlos Jr., started a school project about homeless veterans that educated their classmates about the challenges faced by people who had served their country and were now struggling to survive on the streets. 6 months after the fire, Riverside Apartments installed new fire safety systems and hired Marcus as a consultant to evaluate the emergency preparedness of the building. The residents who had once avoided eye contact with the homeless man behind the dumpster now greeted him by name and thanked him for the lives he'd saved. But perhaps the most significant change was in Marcus himself. For 3 years, Marcus had struggled with the invisible wounds of military service, PTSD, depression, and the sense of purposelessness that many veterans experience when they transition from military service to civilian life. The rescue at Riverside Apartments reminded him that his skills, his training, and his capacity to help others hadn't disappeared when he lost his apartment. They had just been waiting for the right moment to emerge. Marcus began volunteering with organizations that provide services to homeless veterans, using his own experience to help others navigate the challenges of finding housing, employment, and mental health support. He became living proof that homelessness doesn't define a person's worth or capability, and that with the right support, people can rebuild their lives regardless of how far they've fallen. 1 year after the fire, the city honored Marcus with a Civilian Heroism Award, recognizing his actions in saving the Martinez family and his ongoing work with homeless veterans. At the ceremony, Marcus stood on stage wearing his dress uniform for the first time in years, his military decorations displayed alongside the new Civilian Award. "A year ago, I was living behind a dumpster," Marcus said during his acceptance speech. "The community saw me as a problem to be solved or ignored. But when that fire started, I wasn't a homeless man. I was a soldier who saw people in danger and knew I had the skills to help them." Marcus looked out at the audience, which included the Martinez family, his colleagues from the fire department, and dozens of homeless veterans who had come to see one of their own being honored for his courage. Homelessness doesn't erase your training, your experience, or your desire to help others. It just makes it harder for people to see those qualities. Sometimes all it takes is one moment, one chance to show who you really are, to change how an entire community sees you and how you see yourself. After the ceremony, 8-year-old Sofia Martinez approached Marcus with a drawing she'd made of him climbing down the building to rescue her family. At the bottom of the drawing, she'd written, "Thank you for being our hero, even when you didn't have a home." Marcus kept that drawing on his desk at the fire department, where it served as a daily reminder that heroism isn't about having the perfect life or living in the perfect circumstances. It's about using whatever skills and courage you possess to help others when they need it most. Marcus Thompson understood that true service doesn't end when you take off the uniform or when life knocks you down. Sometimes the most important missions happen when you're at your lowest point, when no one expects anything from you, and when helping others is the last thing anyone would ask you to do. Because heroes aren't defined by their housing status, their employment situation, or their current circumstances. They're defined by their willingness to act when action is needed, regardless of the personal cost, and regardless of whether anyone will ever know their name. And sometimes the person sleeping behind the dumpster is the same person who will risk everything to make sure your children come home safely. If you enjoyed this story, click the like button and subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow I have another story especially for you.